So I'm super excited to be here today. This TPM Summit is a really cool event. I didn't actually plan this into my speech, but I took a walk from the Amesworth Hotel along Stevens Creek Trail this morning, and it gave me an opportunity to reflect on how much the Valley has changed in the past 20 years. I started my career when I was 22 at the old Microsoft campus before the present buildings that are there now were around. And I took that walk for the first time maybe about 15, 16 years ago. And just looking around at all the new apartment buildings, all the new office buildings, there's still a few old things that we love, have always been traditionally here, like the Sports Page, the Pear Theater. But it was really cool just to see how much Silicon Valley has changed from being Mountain View and Cupertino being sort of a word we read on a map to an experience that we actually lived. And then taking that walk 15 years later and thinking about all the relationships I've built with amazing TPMs, amazing people at different companies during that time was just really eye-opening. And I'm really grateful to the organizers for putting this together. Wish I had been more involved from the start because I'm really excited to be here. But I'm especially thankful to be here to talk about a topic which has come up repeatedly in my career. It's something I've talked to my peers about for a long time. I've thought about writing a blog about it, and I just had sort of never gotten around to sort of publishing things. I always talked about this in private conversations. So the TPM Summit has kind of given me an opportunity to start speaking about it, and that topic is TPM Archetypes, a framework for navigating our roles, marketing ourselves, and finding jobs we enjoy. I've chuckled at least 5 times this morning because there are many different pronunciations of archetype. I'm going to say archetype. Some people say archetype. You can use your favorite Google search and decide how to pronounce it yourself. A little bit about me. My name is Yakabosky. I'm a staff TPM at FAIR. FAIR is a wholesale online marketplace that connects independent retailers with small brands who basically make products. It's sort of like an Etsy that's been optimized for terms advantageous to wholesale marketplace. We use data science, machine learning, generative AI to do things like write product descriptions, recommend purchases, assess financial risk of different potential customers, and to optimize international shipping and logistics. Myself, I've spent most of my career sort of in back-end and infrastructure systems. I'm not much of a front-end UX specialist. I did learn that when I did the product manager role and realized that the designers were spending a whole hour deciding between which shade of red should go at the top of a screen. I was like, okay, I'm going to back away from the front end. But I have been learning how to use generative AI to enhance some of my storytelling. So you'll see a few fun pictures today generated by AI. And lastly, since this is a TPM Summit, I wanted to share an interesting story about my own career, and that's that my first TPM job was actually for a distributed team when I was making garage video games as a 14-year-old. In the late 90s, early 2000s, broadband internet was just arriving in the United States. The whole online video game thing was taking off, and the reality was that teenagers like myself knew more about personal computers and what was going on with networking than our parents. So my parents sort of thought I was kidding around when I would say, hey, I'm playing video games with people in Asia and Europe and Africa and all around the globe. And that was until I said, hey, I'm taking my lawn mowing money and I'm putting it towards buying a commercial video game license. So my group of friends and I got together, bought a commercial video game license, and I ended up being the project manager because I was the youngest one in the group. I had the least experience writing actual code. Of course, I did go on to study computer science so I could have the right conversations, understand what developers were talking about, but it was really foundational for my own career because I learned that this sort of program management craft of bringing technical people together to solve people and product-oriented problems was a passion of mine. And I was able to spend all of my college years doing internships in program management and my career since then. So the question I want to pose is, what's a TPM do? Just by a raise of hands, who's been asked this question before in some form or another by friends, family, coworkers, whoever? All right. As I expected, it's most of the people in the room. And the reason I asked the question is because I've been asked many times by many different people what a TPM does. Often the person isn't really asking it directly. It's kind of embedded behind a context or a problem that they're trying to solve. And I'll share a few examples of what that might look like. One of the most common times I've been asked what a TPM does is when I'm approaching the end of a big project that I've worked on myself. Often engineering leaders start reaching out and saying, hey, I've really enjoyed working with you. I think I understand the value that TPMs deliver, and I think I'd like to consider hiring a TPM for my own organization. Would you be able to mentor them? Can you coach them? That sort of thing. But those leaders often don't know where to start. Logistically, they don't know how to do things like obtain headcount, how to write a job description, how to ask interview questions, or how to manage a TPM's career. Emotionally, they're a little bit torn because they may have had some great experiences with TPMs, but they've also had some mediocre ones or ones which weren't quite the right fit. So one of the phrases they'll often repeat is, instead of writing like a job description, I wish I could just clone you, or I could clone my favorite TPM that I've worked with before. So that term cloning comes up quite a bit. Another situation in which people ask what TPMs do is with the engineers and the individual contributors that we work with every day. Across the lifetime of a project, I usually end up socializing with my team members, grabbing lunch, grabbing drinks, that sort of thing. And over time, they start to ask me questions like, what is the difference between the different PM acronyms? Why do the TPMs I meet work on so many different things? How does the organization decide where you spend your time? And quite frankly, like, what are you doing in all the meetings? And even though they don't know exactly what a TPM does, you do get a sense that they have an understanding that TPMs have a large sort of strategic impact on the direction of the organization, that they can make changes, they can influence others. And sometimes they want to understand how their teams can leverage TPMs better. Sometimes people have even approached me about, hey, how can I explore a career transition to becoming a TPM myself? And the last situation I'll share is what's a TPM do, how it comes up in the context of a job search. So in my experiences, an important part about interviewing for TPMs isn't that you're determining whether someone is sort of a good TPM or a bad TPM, whether they meet a particular bar. Often what you're looking for is whether someone is the right fit for a particular role or need, whether they have the right style that fits with the group of people and so forth. And if we learn how to talk about what's unique about each of us and how we differ from other TPMs and other candidates, it helps us be able to talk about why we're a good fit for a particular position and stand out. Now, these are just 3 examples. It's not meant to be exhaustive. I'm sure all of us have been asked about our roles in many different ways over the years. But back to that root question. So what's a TPM do? So the more I've been asked this question, the more chances I've had to A/B test different answers. Similar to Jen, sometimes I've screwed up and it wasn't always the best answer. Sometimes it was really good. Early on, what I told a lot of people is, hey, it depends on a lot of variables. It depends on the specific needs of the organization. It depends on the person's skill set and their desire to learn new skills. It depends on how the TPMs are distributed across the company and the culture in which they're working in. But in reality, I found that answer stinks. Most people who aren't TPMs don't want to hear an answer of it depends, and you're going to lose interest pretty quickly. I almost always lost their interest. Either I'd be rambling about all the things that a TPM could do until they checked out, or I asked them so many questions about their own organizational needs, which they weren't really prepared to answer, and the conversation would burn out. I do want to acknowledge it's probably okay to talk about sort of these conditions with other TPMs or other people who understand our profession. But for somebody who's not a TPM and has been confused by the various PM acronyms in the past, it's helpful to make a simplification. And the simplification I came up with is basically offering a menu of different TPM archetypes. So let's all take a moment and think about going to a restaurant. When you go to a restaurant, there's a sort of a certain etiquette. The restaurant doesn't just give their customers a gigantic list of all of the foods that their chefs have ever heard of or prepared in their lifetime. They also don't ask the customer to write a detailed product requirements document outlining everything they'd like to be a part of their meal. Instead, they present the customer with a curated list of options that is easy to understand and highlights that restaurant's strengths. It's essentially the same thing I'm proposing for TPMs, that we offer stakeholders a curated list of things that TPMs can do in order to help them choose which ones they'd like for a particular role or a position. Now, before I do introduce the archetypes, we're going to walk through 6 of them. I want to lean a little bit further into this restaurant analogy. And as I said, there's a certain etiquette to ordering at a restaurant, and there's a certain etiquette to using these archetypes. First thing is, you're never going to go to a restaurant and order everything on the menu. I guess you might for the TPM Summit, as we have a lot of people, but generally you're not going to order everything on the menu. You're going to pick 2 or 3 things that you want to try for that particular meal. Similarly, the next time an engineering manager approaches you and says, like, hey, what should I hire a TPM to do? You're going to tell them to highlight 2 or 3 of their top strengths, and we're going to talk about 2 or 3 archetypes that really match the position. However, these archetypes also aren't meant to constrain us. None of us is tied to one particular archetype. Many of us exhibit knowledge of many of them or even all of them. We often switch between these different types of positions throughout our careers. So just like a restaurant's going to change what they sell based on customer needs, sales, we're always going to be evolving our craft and learning new skills and jumping into these different archetypes. And the last thing is there are always specials on the menu. These archetypes won't cover everything that we can do. Every single person here is unique, offers unique qualities, has skills from their past life, from their past experiences that no one else will offer. So there are always additional skills which aren't represented here. But keeping those things in mind, let's take a look at 6 fun archetypes. And at the end, we're going to do a little poll to see what kind of TPMs we have in the room. So do make sure you download that Zoho app in parallel if you haven't yet. So the first archetype we're going to talk about is the shepherd. The shepherd is also known as the herder, the tracker, or the enforcer. And the shepherd is somebody who tracks and guides large-scale programs, ensuring that everyone follows the rules and stays on the right path. Shepherds often work on large-scale migrations, which are basically programs which require coordination across hundreds or thousands of individuals, often to make a very similar change, but many different actors. Some of us, I know, have even built out formalized processes across our companies because these sort of large-scale migrations are repeatable. And you'll hear terms like horizontal initiatives, large-scale changes, and other industry terms that have been kind of adopted that these shepherds govern. Shepherds are also responsible for optimizing different operational cadences. This includes things like incident management, security review, post-mortems, and making sure that the critical action items that come out of those are shepherded, again, through completion and impact on the site. Shepherds are often very qualitative and visual. They're quite frankly presenting a lot of charts. It's a good way to share information about progress, is showing charts and graphs. So visual acuity is very important. They also need to be strong communicators because the information that they'll share is going to cascade across the organization. When they're writing messages to ICs, the instructions of what they're actually asking them to do need to be clear, precise, and tested. When they're communicating to executives, sort of the progress and next steps need to also be clear. Lastly, the shepherd is somebody who needs to have studied how to influence different types of people. Because in the course of these migrations, they're going to face a lot of challenges. There's going to be a lot of pushback. There's complicated situations. Similar to what Jen said, rather than just saying you haven't done this, you haven't done this, someone who's able to get in the ground, understand their relative priorities, understand the emotional health of the teams, and find a way to get those prioritized is very important. So this person does need to have strong EQ. Second archetype we'll look at is the architect. This is also known as the builder or the technical product owner. Architects are hands-on with a technology's cross-functional design and operations, and they're responsible for developing long-term strategy and roadmap. One of the things that they often work on is sort of the design of next-generation platforms. Being in the Valley for 15, 20 years, one thing you see is that companies kind of redo their architecture every couple years. They might switch to a new cloud provider. They might overhaul their data model. They might switch to a new service architecture. And these things often require someone with a lot of expertise on what worked in the past model and what's going to scale in the future. The architect archetype might be involved also in things like vendor analysis, looking at third-party tools for incorporation into the stack, making recommendations between buy, build, and sometimes open sourcing or borrowing from other companies. Architects are often subject matter experts in a particular technology. They may have spent much of their career working in the same space, and a lot of the time you often find that they were previously engineers who have become TPMs because they wanted to have that larger strategic impact. There are people who like to keep up with emerging technology, know the latest things coming out, looking at what different vendors are putting out, and they tend to tinker and build a lot of prototypes. And perhaps most interesting is the last bullet point around complementing other roles, because architect TPMs do work with other people who might have that archetype. Product managers, tech leads, engineering managers. But what a TPM brings is unique, and I'll talk about each of those. So for like a consumer product manager, they're generally going to be focused on the end user experience. So something like the latency at which a page loads and the number of click-throughs that drives revenue, whereas the TPM will be an expert on behind the scene things like observability, scalability, elasticity. Engineering managers often have a limited line of sight because they're often split up into different verticals, like your web and mobile teams, your ingestion teams, your data scientists, your storage teams, or whatever. And a lot of the time they know their immediate upstream and downstream customers, but once you get at the scale that a lot of our organizations are built, and there's like 40 or 50 hops between the time a data enters the system and when it's fully used, they often don't have that insight of all the upstream and downstream dependencies where the TPM would really understand how data flows across the entire stack. And the last type, which is tech leads, well, in reality, a lot of tech leads understand the theory of how things should work, but when you get on the ground and talk to the teams who operate those systems day to day, it's diverged so much from the theory that there's a lot of lost context between the way things do work and all the scripting and manual operations that have been built to support it. The TPM will be close enough to those operational teams they can understand the actual day-to-day usage of different systems. The third archetype we'll talk about is the mechanic, and there's lots of names for the mechanic. They're also known as coaches or SDLC and tools experts. Their job is to ensure that teams across the organization are equipped with the right tools, processes, and training needed to achieve their goals. Mechanics influence process in a variety of ways. Sometimes they do sort of like a one-time operation to help a new team or a new program get bootstrapped and set up with minimal process that they need. Other times they're looking at more repeatable programs, such as choosing a suite of best practices that should be adopted across the entire company, and then influencing everyone to adopt that. Those often look like things like agile transformations or migrations to a new ticketing system, and the goal is often consistency. Mechanics also often sort of float across teams, going where they're needed. When new systems are spinning up or a team is scaling, they often rotate from team to team, kind of offering different ideas of how they could scale their own processes and tools. And that's why they're sometimes called coaches. Mechanics need to be very passionate about collaboration. They're people who genuinely believe in what people can achieve at scale when a large number of people are equipped with the right processes and tools. Sort of you can go further in a group, you can go fast by yourself, but mechanics are interested in going further. They're usually very opinionated because they're not just doing administrative stuff like setting up Jira boards when they're asked to. What they're usually doing is making recommendations in complex situations where they're working with a group of stakeholders who don't have an agreed upon way of doing things. They have different opinions, And this person really needs to kind of have conviction and be able to influence and convince people to try something out, iterate, evolve, but they need to be able to bring these people together and be opinionated about how to build consensus. And lastly, they are often experts in a particular suite of tools or processes. Mechanics are often people who keep up with their certifications. They might attend Agile meetups. They might be experts in SAFe that Jen also talked about. They might go to seminars from Atlassian, or they might be able to tell you all the greatest Jira widgets that you can attach to a project. Kicking off the second half of our archetypes is the translator. Translator is also known as the liaison, the voice of the customer, or the customer advocate. The translator builds close relationships with customers in order to prioritize their needs into functional requirements that a development team can actually execute on. Translators help teams prioritize the right things in a product backlog by talking to customers and often using different techniques to identify sort of trends or themes. Sometimes this is like NPS or customer satisfaction surveys. Sometimes customers are not necessarily very technical. They might come from a business background, be a customer service team, be a finance team. And the translator's job is often to translate business requirements into technical requirements. As I mentioned, the translator will care that customer satisfaction is going up over time, so they'll do different things to sort of keep pulse on how customers are feeling over time. And personality-wise, they need to have an intimate knowledge of an end-to-end product experience. For example, if they are building a UI to manage infrastructure resources, they need to know what developers go through without that UI to understand the process, the pain points, what works well, what needs improvement, and so forth. So they really need to be intimate with the life cycle of what they're building. The translator also needs to be very approachable by their customers, kind and empathetic, someone that people feel comfortable making requests to, asking questions, clarifying things that might be ambiguous from design documents. But they also have to have some sort of persistence with the engineering teams. As we all know, you sometimes have to bring things up 7 or 8 times before it sort of cognitively settles in. So translators also need to be patient and sort of persistent with bringing these customer requirements up, finding different ways to present them. One of the most exciting roles is the firefighter. I'm sure some of you have experience doing this. Maybe it's your full-time job. A firefighter is also known as the parachute, the hero, the fixer, and sometimes even the detective. The firefighter parachutes into programs which are struggling, investigating what's going on, and finding ways to pivot the effort into a big success. Firefighters are often stuck in positions that are, quite frankly, out of their control. A lot of the problems are things that start before they get involved. So it might be something like an emerging privacy law that needs to be implemented within a fixed time frame, or it might be a response to some sort of bad publicity that the company has actually received. They work on programs that are often kind of complex and, quite frankly, sometimes dysfunctional from the start. There's a lot of ambiguity, conflicting expectations, and unclear roles. But the plus side to being a firefighter is that it gives you a very high level of influence. These types of projects often require executive attention, and even participation from the C-suite. And when you're a firefighter, you have opportunities to sort of disrupt the status quo and the way that things have been done for a long time. You're going to be asking tough questions, and you have the opportunity to change the foundations of the company. One of the alternative names I mentioned is the detective, and I think that's because this person has to be very inquisitive and ask tough questions that everyone else has shied away from asking before. Things like, are we doing the right thing? Why are we doing it this way? It seems like that went really badly. I don't think we should do it again. People tend to shy away from these questions, and it's the firefighter's role to actually ask them. Sometimes they can even be perceived as a bit antagonistic in the short term, whereas long term, of course, they become everyone's hero. Firefighters need to be solution-oriented. Some of these problems aren't going to have very elegant or perfect solutions. Sometimes you need to take shortcuts, accrue technical debt, but the important thing is that they can get the problem solved, and you can go back and sort of perfect it later. Lastly, I'll share that this person needs to be pretty assertive and have conviction over the recommendations they make because they're being trusted with a lot of important company decisions. So they need to be strongly opinionated and assertive about what they believe we should do. And the last archetype we'll talk about is the umbrella. This is probably my favorite generated image. The umbrella is also known as the chief of staff or the portfolio manager. The umbrella builds processes and interfaces that govern multiple projects, programs, or portfolios in order to give executives visibility into what's going on in a sort of consistent and understandable way. The umbrella is similar to the shepherd in the fact that they're both working on these high visibility projects with executives, but I do want to call out the shepherd's projects generally have an end state. You've completed a migration, you've fixed all the issues, whereas umbrella is more of a repeatable process. Things like quarterly planning, half-year planning, annual planning. How are we going to keep doing these things on a recurring basis and improve over time? They'll often do things like build a process that continuously rolls up these different statuses and KPIs across the portfolio. They'll also create common interfaces for heavily federated projects. They'll often have other TPMs or engineering managers sort of managing their own localized portion of the program and then reporting key things into this centralized process managed by the umbrella. And each of those subgroups is maybe following a different process, so it's important that this umbrella brings something together that's comprehensive and everybody can integrate with, but also synthesize the information as it goes upward. Umbrellas need to be adaptable because they're seeing so many different programs. They're going to learn new things every day, minor things that need to be changed. But they also need to set very deterministic expectations because they're affecting such a large group of people. They need to be clear of what they're asking, by when. If these sorts of things change, they need to give people heads ups before they're thrown in a situation where an executive's asking them a question they're not prepared for. They need to be accountable and hold others accountable. They need to make sure that progress is happening between these various things. They're not just collecting status, they're actually driving the follow-up between them. And lastly, I would say the umbrella needs to think like an executive. There's a lot of garbage coming in, but you can't have garbage coming out. So this person needs to be able to think like an executive, highlight the information that's most important, and filter out some of those updates that aren't necessarily relevant. So what I wanted to do is do something fun. I thought it'd be a fun idea to poll the TPM Summit, and as I mentioned, we all represent these different archetypes, but it'd be fun to see what sort of distribution we have in the room. So I wanted to ask 4 questions. Which 3 archetypes best describe your current state of your career? What is one archetype you'd like more opportunities in? Are there any archetypes you really hate doing or avoid in your career? And can you think of any other fun ones you'd like to share during Q&A? And you can take the poll in the Zoho Backstage app for this session. We'll review it in a couple minutes. Take your time filling it out. We're going to talk through some other stuff, and then we'll review the results. But while you download that, I thought I'd show some other fun images I generated that turned out a little weird. So I asked for an intimidating herder/enforcer, and they made a pretty tough guy up there in the upper left. The technical product owner turned out to be a pretty boring image, but perhaps accurate. We generated what I can only imagine to be an extremely athletic coach. The voice of the customer I actually really liked, but if you look closely, one of the things that the voice of the customer is sort of elevating is that the customer apparently yelled slap at the team. And I don't know why they asked, so I couldn't use that image. A very nice inquisitive detective, and then a chief of staff where the AI conflated 2 different prompts I gave it. One to basically have a butler holding an umbrella, and the other that like an executive should be overseeing everything. And it turned it into the executive being like a Pringles can on the actual umbrella. That was fun. Okay. So before we take a look at the poll results, I want to touch base on how we can actually apply some of these archetypes. So let's talk about that first scenario where the engineering manager wants to hire a TPM, but they're not really sure how. What are some ways we can use the archetypes to help them decide? So the first thing we can do is we can tell them to focus on 2 to 3 archetypes. Look at this list, choose the 3 things that you really need, and write the job description about those areas. For example, maybe you keep having incidents that come up, and what you need is a firefighter to drive those sub-zeros to resolution. You need a shepherd to make sure all the action items that come out of those are completed on time and within budget. And you might need a translator who then needs to go talk to these various customer teams and to understand the different pain points that they're having. You can also exclude what isn't important. A lot of the time, people have an assumption that TPMs are mostly mechanics. And a lot of the time, the reality is organizations have healthy processes and tools, and they're not looking for a mechanic. So you can tell the manager, hey, don't include that in the job description. Second thing you can do is you can work with your recruiting teams. My spouse is a recruiter, and I don't love the way that recruiting works. It's often filtered by school, past jobs, those sorts of things. I actually prefer to provide her with sourcing criteria, looking for different keywords that match to these archetypes. I think that you can also help your recruiter source really good candidates by looking for these experiences rather than just sort of attributes about the past. And the last thing you can do is you can use these archetypes to inform the questions you ask in the interview. You can ask what sort of 2 or 3 things they see themselves doing in the first 6 months, how they see their career evolving long term, and you can deliberately poke at the specific things that you know the team needs, that you're looking for in this person, and see their match to being that person. Now, if we flip the table around, and let's be a TPM who's actually interviewing for a position, how can you use these archetypes to help you when you're getting asked these tough questions? So the first thing you can do is you can actually think about them when you're trying to understand the role. When you're reading the job description, when you're back channeling with friends who work at the company to understand the existing TPM culture that's there and what many of the TPMs are like. You can also have opportunities throughout the interview to ask questions, and sometimes bringing up these archetypes is a great conversation starter. It'll bring you closer to sometimes the hiring manager or the interviewer. Of course, the second thing we can do is we can use these archetypes to market how well we match to the specific needs. You can say something like, hey, I've been developing in this platform space for 20 plus years. I pretty much see myself as an architect. I can spec out and work with your teams to design and deliver this next version of things. But hey, it's also not going to end at just a proof of concept. I also happen to be a shepherd. And once we get that first 5% of applications migrated, I'm also the person who's going to get the other 95% migrated. And you can pitch yourself to all phases of the different project, how you're going to rotate archetypes throughout it. And lastly, you can talk about any bonus archetypes you bring to the table. Sometimes interviewers don't know everything a TPM does. Sometimes there are experiences that can really help you stand out. Often you're going to be maybe having an equal score to another candidate, and sometimes talking about these bonus skills or these add-ons are things that can make them make the final decision to make you an offer. And the last situation we'll talk about is how TPM managers, because I know there's a few of you here today, can talk about the TPM archetypes in the context of career growth. So sometimes TPMs get a lot of positive feedback that they're like an expert or really good at one thing. But that can both limit their opportunities to try other things, and it can limit their exposure to important stakeholders across the company. So being able to have conversations about rotating between these becomes increasingly important. And some of the ways that TPM managers can broach this conversation is first by recognizing and celebrating someone's existing strengths. If they fought your firefighters, tell them how much the company has really valued all the emergencies that they've handled, the expediency, the stress that they've experienced. If there's someone who has revamped the way you work with your customers and operated as a translator, you can talk about how they've really transformed the way the organization works with its customers. Second thing you can do is you can ask about past experiences and future interests. You might even find some traumas there. For example, maybe someone, when they were 22 and fresh out of university, was stuck in a position where they were supposed to be a technical product owner or an architect, and maybe they weren't ready for that. 10, 15 years later, maybe they're ready to take on that challenge and have that role. Similarly, maybe someone was an umbrella role in a previous organization, but the engineering manager didn't really appreciate the value that TPMs could bring, and they felt undervalued, and they'd like another opportunity to be an umbrella with the right engineering leader. And lastly, managers can start reaching out to managers early and advocating for these archetypes, as well as ways to accelerate the roadmaps when engineering managers are planning them. I can't underemphasize how important it is for managers to be letting the engineering leads know what's available and how TPMs can sort of help accelerate these programs by getting ahead. And the last call out, these archetypes do even help to explain our jobs to our friends and family. My parents don't understand what I do. My wife doesn't understand what I do. It's really simple to say, like, Sherry over here, she's more of an umbrella, I'm more of a shepherd, and kind of compare and contrast us that way when talking to friends and family. Or, in this case, your kids. All right, so if it worked, let's take a look at the poll results. Do you want to shout them out?
Yeah.
We can do some live interaction.
3 archetypes that best describe you. We've got Shepherd at the highest at 66%, Architect, Mechanic. Actually, Firefighter's pretty high, which makes sense for TPMs.
Yeah, the lowest one is Umbrella. All right.
Yeah.
Which archetype would you like more opportunities? Actually, the highest one there coming in is the Umbrella.
Which, there you go, makes sense.
40%.
That's the lowest of what people...
Yeah, least experience, 40%. Second place is Architect at 27%. That also makes sense. We often have tech leads who are playing those roles. And what archetype do people avoid doing? At 35%, we have the Firefighter. Surprise. I wonder if that is before being a firefighter and then you develop a trauma and don't want to do it again. Very cool. All right. I think with that, we'll transition to Q&A. My first Q&A question was actually for all of you, whether there are any other interesting archetypes you'd like to share and call out. So 1 or 2 people said they have one in the poll. Anybody?
Maybe we just
8.
take one question because we are already on time.
Yeah,
so any one question in the room?
All right, not new archetypes. Any general questions?
We can take an online question if you want.
Yep. Let's do it.
Yeah, there's a question here which says, it's translation between different organizations, engineering, business, and levels like IC, director, C-suite, part of one of these or all of them, or is that a separate archetype?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would probably bundle it with the translator that I had, but I did have it focused more on customer translation. In this case, I think it's probably an aspect of all of these roles, right? Communication and disseminating information is important for every TPM role. I would probably, if I had to fit it into one of these, I would attach it to translator. At one point, I was sketching out like 8 to 16 archetypes, but there wasn't nearly enough time to cover all of those, so maybe in a future blog we'll expand. Okay, that's it. Thank you guys so much. Have a great day.